Welcome to Descendants of the Imagination. My name is Yasmin Juarez and I will be your host.
And I'm Aldi Janakis, close to Neary Lagoon in one of Santa Cruz's oldest neighborhoods.
Today's conversation is on oral storytelling with an emphasis on oral histories within the Santa Cruz community. I would like to welcome Santa Cruz writer Dana Bagshaw.
Thank you, Yasmin. It's really nice to be here.
Glad to have you here. You began your writing career in Silicon Valley after receiving your degree from San Jose State University.
I studied playwriting, but I needed to earn money, so I got a practical job writing as a technical writer in Silicon Valley, writing user manuals and user guides to accounting packages and spreadsheets and databases, things like that.
Well, your current project is called Street Scenes.
Street Scenes is going to be a collection of stories told by people who lived in my neighborhood. Some of them still do, in the 30s and 40s. And I was just curious as to what life was like at that time. And so I just began going around and asking questions. And then I got the idea that maybe there was something worth recording here.
It's between downtown and the beach. It's between the upper terrace part of where California is and downtown proper. It's between the lagoon and town proper. It's almost not in. When I lived here, when I first lived here, it was almost not even in town. You would just walk, and there would be a lot of vacant lots and stuff.
No one seems to know about this neighborhood. I couldn't get answers. And it's just sort of like a neglected little neighborhood, and like, oh, the history of this isn't important because there was no rich, famous, important people in this neighborhood.
Well, except for the fact that it's richer now. But I think it was always pretty much the kind of neighborhood I moved into. A mixed neighborhood that's mostly working class, but mostly like employed type working class. So.
It was once called the Italian Flats, too.
Oh, I didn't even know that one. I'm not surprised, though, because I think,
And the Stigneros and the ones that sort of made it big in the fishing industry lived up on the hill. The Italians that lived here were worked at this cement plant in Davenport.
How would they get there in those days?
They went by Greyhound bus.
Oh.
When I grew up here, there was only probably 10 houses on the block here, 10, 12 houses. Now look.
In '85, the neighborhood became high density.
Oh my gosh, it's crazy, huh? You have it over there too.
Oh yeah.
I used to walk up out the backyard, across the field to play with Lauralee and Maureen, where you live today.
And half their house was destroyed. There was a glassed-in porch, and a huge dorm room was built.
There was empty lots there next to it. Also had horses. We had horses there too.
Yeah, on the original map, there's a workshop that is bigger than the house in the backyard. The house was smaller, and there was a industrial, or I don't know. You said he was meat.
Yeah, he was a meat cutter.
Maybe it was his meat cutting place.
Could have been.
Was it bigger than the house?
It didn't even have a name as a neighborhood until a few years ago.
I've got the impression that for a lot of people, it's been a transition neighborhood. They'll come here when they first immigrate to Santa Cruz, get their feet on the ground, and then they'll move on. But then other people love the neighborhood, and they just stay here.
In its early beginnings, Santa Cruz's two main downtown streets, now Pacific Avenue and Front Street, both led to meadows, pasture lands, and a large lagoon that emptied into the Monterey Bay. The area is known as South of Laurel. Today, south of Laurel is a lively area of small neighborhoods, businesses, and a much scaled-down lagoon in a park-like setting.
I found out at UCSC there's someone there who could help me learn about oral histories. Irene Reddy. She gave me some tips on how to do it. I started taking a little microphone with me when I would ask people questions.
So oral history generally focuses on preserving a historical era through those people connected to it. What exactly are you preserving about the neighborhood through your stories?
There was an Italian community that lived there. It was called the Italian Flats, and they were all cousins and related to each other, and they had a very close-knit life. I just feel that people sort of created their own lives in those days that didn't come to them packaged like it is for us today.
So what is the difference between writing about Alice and as compared to writing about Stan and Angelo?
With Alice, it was the story of an individual. I was just getting her story. Whereas my project, The Street Scenes, with Angelo and Stan and some of the women from the neighborhood as well, is that it was a community. Seeing how they lived together as a community and getting different angles of the same story. Like one person would say something and then I'd check it out with another person and they say, oh no, that wasn't true. You know, so you're kind of, I feel like I'm sort of a moderator gleaning the story from them.
What do you see as the future of your Street Scenes project?
I've invited the neighbors. We're going to walk around the neighborhood and tell the stories, and hoping some of the people that have told me the stories will come to the party and I won't have to do all the talking so we can get the stories straight from them. And then take it from there. It might be an article, it might be a chapter in a book, I don't know. Three cousins that I'm going to talk about: Barbara, Angelo, and Rose Lippy. Rose said that the kids that used to all play together out in the street, Angelo says that his uncle said Myrtle used to be a river, and they used to play a lot of football, baseball out in the street. They played Mother May I. Does anybody remember that game? Yeah. She was kind of a little, a very adventuresome girl. She said that she used to play back in the pasture, and they climbed up in one of those big trees, and they were smoking thistles. And the tree caught on fire, and they had to bring out the fire department. She said she really got into trouble. Another thing they did in the Lippy's house is they made wine. And she remembers making wine with her father and hanging on to the press as it went around, and then getting to eat some of the foam that came off the wine and getting drunk when she was only 6 years old from the foam from the wine.
Great memory.
Yeah. It's funny the things that these people do remember. So
You still live around. When did you talk?
I talked to her recently. No, she moved out of the neighborhood. She lives over on Branch of 40.
Oh.
Rose Lippy. I want to tell them about, and you remembered some of this stuff. So down that way, it was all kind of commercial, right? And industrial, or light industry. So apparently about right here was the central supply, sand and gravel, and there was like a conveyor belt and a weighing station, and trucks would come in and they would get rocks. Yeah, Rose remembers climbing up on the conveyor belt. Did you ever do that?
What?
Oh, yeah. And Angelo talks about how the cement mixer would start at like 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning every morning. And it would wake him up. He talked a lot about the sounds that he would hear. On the other side, right at the intersection of Laurel and Chestnut, was the ice plant.
The Union Ice Plant supplied ice to most businesses and individuals in Santa Cruz. It also froze the fish from fleets before commercing it out by rail or ship.
What would be squid, sardines, and salmon.
And shipped on the trains?
No, they put them in the freezer and then they would ship them. So today, you know that our calamari gets shipped, frozen on the ships and shipped all the way to China and back again.
As this drawing shows, the railroad stopped right at the plant's docking area on what is now Chestnut Street.
Way back, you could buy blocks of ice and chipped ice because everyone had ice boxes, not refrigerators.
Yeah, my father and my uncle worked for the ice company, and what they would do, they would have these big blocks of ice, like 50 to 100-pound blocks of ice, and they would take them to the wharf, and restaurants would use the ice for their cold storage. If the ice company made the ice, right.
They had to make it.
Yeah.
That was huge blocks. I mean, I'm talking blocks as big as that garage door, and then they would saw it in the small pieces. You know, when I say small pieces, I mean 50-pound chunks. You know, and these guys would carry them on their back.
Yeah. So what time frame are you talking?
Late, the early 50s.
Yeah. So refrigeration was
just
pretty
coming
common by that time.
Yeah, refrigeration put them out of business.
So I think they kept the cold storage place after the ice company went out.
Right. Well, yeah, it all burnt.
It all burnt down.
It caught fire, and it burned enough to where they had to tear it down.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a fun thing for you kids. When they brought the railroad through, the circus would come to town. Angelo remembers going out and seeing the people come in for the circus.
It was a big deal. I mean, Santa Cruz was a small little town. Across the street of where the 7-Eleven store is today, there used to be a flower company, and they had a big overhang enclosed where they would keep the elephants. And when I say maybe a half a dozen elephants, but it was really neat when you're only 8 years old, 9 years old to go down to see elephants.
Yeah.
Where was the big top?
Well, they used to actually they would sometimes have it at the Civic Auditorium indoors or at Harvey West Park.
So I think it moved around to different places, but it always started here, and then they would parade to wherever they were going to perform.
Where did they get off?
Right here.
Right here.
Train.
Right there.
Yeah.
On this street.
Yes. Well, the turntable was just right over there. Rose Lippy remembers there was a suntan special.
Right.
Come from San Francisco, bring people in to get their suntans on the beach.
Right.
The train would slow down once it got to Laurel. And she would go and hop on the train while it was still moving, and she would get little drinks of water out of the little paper cups that they used to have on the cone-shaped cups. this was your grandfather's house?
This was my grandfather's house and my grandmother's. Johnny Anino and Josephina Anino. Grandfather came from Chileano, Italy at the age of 14. And he was born in 1896, so about 1904, somewhere around there.
What did he do?
He worked for the cement plant.
In Davenport. All this whole neighborhood was Davenport people.
Picked up by the bus, and they would take him to work and then bring him home at night. And then they would stop and have their little cocktail before they came home.
And play bocce ball.
And play bocce ball, exactly.
And on Saturday night, they had dances there. Barbara talks about going to dances there.
I belong to this Italian club called the Marconi Club, and there's some of the older guys, and they passed away now, but they lived in Bonnie Doon, and they tell stories about walking from Bonnie Doon, or getting from Bonnie Doon to Santa Cruz to dance with the Nino girls on Saturday night.
The Nino girls.
Yeah, there were 4 of them. There were 4 girls. So.
Must have been good looking.
So the Laurel Inn was down at the end of the street. On the corner.
I mean the Via Rabazo, right?
Yes. And they used to have, that's where the bus would pick them up and take them to the Davenport.
This was all Italian. These buildings here back in the old, this was all fields. The house there, the tea house, what they call the tea house, that was still there.
They used these vacant lots for planting vegetables, right?
Yeah, a lot of people just use the vacant lots. And this house was not built here, it was moved here. Back in the mid-20s, early 30s, you know.
Yeah, I can remember seeing houses put on flatbeds and just moved. Yeah.
This actually came from California Avenue, up on California Street. All my aunts went to Santa Cruz High School. And my oldest aunt still living is 94.
4 generations of Stan's family have lived in this house.
Gave a tour of your neighborhood on the 4th of July
Yeah,
to
that was fun. Yeah.
mostly your neighbors. How did that go for you?
And it's just fun to share it because I think these days you just kind of move into the house that you can afford to, and you don't really have a real big choice as to where you live, and you just kind of plop yourself in. But because our house was so interesting, I was curious, and I think people appreciate knowing about their neighborhood. He painted a star on this side. He painted a flag on the other side. 2 people told me once an airplane came through, saw the pasture, saw the marker on the roof, and tried to land here because he thought it was an airfield. And so there was lots of excitement in the neighborhood that day when the plane buzzed them. So, okay.
What was their last name?
Barbara Jean Quiddy.
That was the maiden name.
Yeah.
She said she was born around here.
She was born in this house.
In the front
That's right.
bedroom.
There were lines that marked how high the water was here. 1955 or something like that, and then it was, I think a little lower, it was 1974. Was there another flag?
Right, yeah.
So they have these lines, you can make them out, I think, right here.
55 was a bigger flag.
Yeah, okay.
Earlier in the week, I had taken a couple of private tours of the lagoon with Dana, who explained the lagoon's transformation.
Mary Lagoon is thought to have been an oxbow bend of the San Lorenzo River. But I think all this part was once a river delta. This is where it opens up into the so-called lagoon. Mary is no longer a natural lagoon. You can see how it drained out right to the bay, which no longer happens. Here we are at the spot where Mary Lagoon was cut off by the railroad in the 1880s, so that the lagoon could still flow out, but the ocean could not come back in. And that's the definition of a lagoon, is that there's an exchange of water. And then the salt water and the fresh water can mix, so you get the brackish water, which is actually what happens at the mouth of the San Lorenzo River now. There was actually a Chinatown here, back towards where the apartments are now. That was back in the 1880s. There was a Chinatown up on Front Street where like CVS and Trader's Vic's is now. That caught on fire, and at that time Chinatown split into two Chinatowns. One of them went to like an island in the middle of the river, and those were the ones who had been converted to Christianity. But the ones who were not Christian came here to a smaller Chinatown. So this is the spot where the map shows that a small Chinatown once existed, and it's the one that Mrs. Blackburn built. Well, Judge Blackburn was one of the very first pioneers here in Santa Cruz, and he made his fortune with potatoes, selling potatoes to the gold miners, okay, the gold panners. And he married a woman named Harriet. They had a son who only lived 2 years. And after he died, 3 years later, the judge died. So Mrs. Blackburn was a widow, childless, and had loads of money. And apparently she really was a good businesswoman, managed the money, and she was also a very charitable person. And she also let them grow gardens, and there was an orchard and all that here. And there was about 10 men. It was mostly Chinatown in those days was men, but it was all men here, about 10 men. And then when the railroad came through, then they tore down Chinatown, and they reunited with the bigger Chinatown.
The smaller print reads that the many Chinese immigrants who came for gold and a better life ended up as cheap labor. Pooling resources together, they leased their gardens to sell produce, and they built shacks in the gardens to live in. When a few who owned small businesses started rising out of poverty, they faced an anti-Chinese campaign to drive them out.
You need to talk to Angelo, the neighbors tell me. He's lived in that house on the corner for a long time. It's one of 2 matching houses that show up on an 1880 map. I've knocked on his front door, I say. No answer. Oh, he uses the back door, walk around the corner to the driveway, and go to the back porch. I stand on the back porch, and he talks to me through the screen door. Lots of Italians lived here, on Jenny and Myrtle, and we were all related, my uncles, aunts, and cousins. I guess they stuck together because of discrimination. They called us WAPs in those days. Lucy, do the stories of Angelo and Stan evoke any memories about the neighborhood?
Well, we've determined that the person that I have the earliest memory from, or earliest information from, is probably Angelo's aunt. I was just out walking in my neighborhood, and on Jenny Street, there was this little lady at the door, and she was probably in her 80s, and this would be 1977. And she started telling me about living there since she was born, and I guess in that same house. Mm-hmm. And she said that when she was a teenager, this whole neighborhood was incredibly diverse, that there were people of every nationality she could imagine. She went to Santa Cruz High School. She said all of the kids from the school would work in the bean farm owned by a Japanese family where the apartments are at the end of Felix Street now. And then there was a German family that lived in my house on Neary Street and owned a brewery across the street. which during Prohibition did soda and before Prohibition did beer. And I think that brewery lasted till the 50s. It was the Santa Cruz Brewing Company. When they tore down the old building to build the houses that are there now, underneath the foundation was a pile of old bottles. They had a picture of the roller coaster on them. As you remember that the original roller coaster was built in like 1905, 1910, something like that.
So do you feel the neighborhood is still diverse?
It's still, but some of the changes are threatening that quite a bit. I mean, I would say that in the last few years, the price of housing has changed the neighborhood a lot. You have many more vacation homes in the neighborhood, and
rentals.
No, well, rentals I don't mind. I mean, when I moved in this neighborhood, it was full of rentals, and but the families would stay in the same rental house for generations. They wouldn't necessarily buy a house because they wouldn't necessarily ever have the down payment and all the things you need to qualify. But when the neighborhood becomes wealthier, then some of the people that used to live here can't live here anymore. Like, when I lived here, there were a number of black families. There were a lot of Hispanic families. Said other things. I'm afraid I don't remember all of the nationalities that she mentioned, but she was very, very proud of the fact that it had been a diverse neighborhood and that everybody got along. She said it made it sound like an integrated utopia, which was exactly right up my alley. That was actually why we moved there in 1977, was because it was, for Santa Cruz, it was a very diverse neighborhood at the time.
That's an interesting contrast.
It is, because if it was her nephew that was talking about how it was an Italian neighborhood, and she's saying, oh, it was this lovely, diverse neighborhood.
Running out of time, and I'd like to thank Dana Bagshaw and Lucy Chemnitzer for taking us on a tour into one of Santa Cruz's historic neighborhoods for a past worth remembering. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was fun being here.